Hi everybody, I hope you're okay. I hope you had a good Easter. So I thought I'd present the main bit of today's lesson from York. So here I am in York, and the building behind me, you can see there, some of you may recognise if you go into York much, but this is the King's Manor. So this is where Henry VII stayed before his eldest daughter Margaret headed up to Scotland to marry King James. This is where Henry VIII stayed in 1541 when he stayed with his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, and they stayed in a room which is just over there above the green door, and that's where Catherine Howard was meeting Thomas Culpeper to commit adultery, which she would later be executed for. What I thought we'd do today is just have a little look at the foreign policy of Henry VII, and I thought it might be a good time after Easter to go back and have a look at who the sort of main runners and riders, who the main powers were in Europe when Henry VII came to the throne. So we're just going to have a quick look at each of those powers before we start assessing whether or not Henry VII achieved his aims in foreign policy. So first up, England. So obviously Henry VII became King of England in 1485. England was recovering from the Wars of the Roses. It had been ravaged by 30 years of civil wars, basically. And a lot of this results from the downfall of Henry VI, who's the king who was most to blame for the Wars of the Roses. And a lot of that has to do with foreign policy. You know, Henry VI was crowned King of France, but he lost France over the course of his reign. So, since the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453, England had had no real involvement in European affairs. We had limited military resources, there was no standing army, and of course this meant that when the king needed to raise troops, he was dependent upon his nobles. So this is why bastard feudalism was such a problem in the late 15th century. We had some interests in foreign policy, so we still had Calais. That was a source of pride for England. And we had a big interest as well in the Netherlands, and particularly Antwerp, which was so important as far as England's cloth trade was concerned, the wool trade was concerned. So that's England. So moving on, the big enemy, France. So France was ruled at the start of Henry's reign by Charles VIII. He'd become king in 1483, and France had been expanding for some time before this. So mainly under the reign of Henry VI, France managed to win back all of the land which they'd lost in the 100 Years' War to England. So France was a big, powerful country. It was starting to reassert itself in Europe as well at the time. So it was the most powerful nation in Europe at the time, and it was the most powerful nation in Europe for a number of reasons. So firstly, it had a large and it had a professional army, unlike England. Secondly was its size. It had 15 million people living there, so that meant that it was a rich country because it also taxed its people. So the King of France was much, much wealthier than the King of England. Its interests at the time tended to be in Italy, but it was an old traditional enemy of England. You know, Henry VII became King of England because he landed Milford Haven with a number of French troops with French assistance. So it created Henry VII in many ways, France. It could also break Henry VII, which is why when they get involved in the Perkin-Warbeck affair, it's such a problem for him. Like I say, their main interest was Italy. Now, Italy wasn't Italy as we know it today. Italy was made up of a number of principalities, and they were very wealthy, but they were crumbling. So many of Europe's main powers were basically fighting and trying to mop up some of those principalities. Italy were one of these, in particularly Naples and Milan, they had their eyes on. So Brittany was another one of the powers that we have looked at. So Francis II ruled Brittany when Henry VII became king. He had been Henry's knight in shining armour, basically, his protector whilst Henry was in exile. So Brittany is located in the northwest coast of France. It was a duchy. Henry was keen for Brittany not to fall into French hands, because that would mean that the entire northern French coastline would be controlled by France. So he wanted it to remain an ally of his, because it would weaken France, particularly if they had any intention of invading England. So, as I say, Francis was an ally of England, and he needed to try to prevent Brittany from falling under the control and under the command of Charles VIII. So that's Brittany. So next up, sorry, the wind's really getting up. Next up we have Spain. So Spain was at the time united, and it was united because of the unity between Castile and Aragon, with the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. So it was becoming an important power in Europe, and it had a number of aims itself. So it wanted to drive the Moors, or the Muslims, out of southern Spain. Secondly, it wanted to secure its northern border, in particular Navarre. So Navarre had been lost to France in the 1460s. Isabella and Ferdinand wanted to win it back. And thirdly, they wanted to exploit the chaos in Italy as well, and they would clash with France over Naples. So what this did was it served to increase the chances of an alliance with Spain against France, who was England's traditional enemy. So that's Spain. So moving on, Burgundy. So Burgundy is a territory which is ruled by the Dukes of Burgundy. It contains the Netherlands and the Low Countries as well. So Burgundy was important for Henry VII for two reasons. Firstly, it was the principal sort of trading centre for England in Antwerp. So it was very important for English trade. And secondly, and we've looked at her, Edward IV's sister, Margaret of Burgundy, was somebody who could, and somebody who, as we've seen, did act against Henry on two main occasions, with Lambert Simnel and also with Perkin Warbeck. But Burgundy is very important for English trade. Okay, so we also have the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire stretched over much of Central Europe. It was huge. It was 20 million people strong, and it was increasingly feared in Europe, partly because of its population and partly because of its size. So Maximilian was the Holy Roman Emperor for much of the reign of Henry VII. He had added Burgundy to his territories, which made it very important as far as England was concerned. He did this when he married Mary of Burgundy. And Maximilian also had ambitions as far as Italy were concerned, which takes us to Scotland. So Scotland was small, had a population of 400,000 roughly. It was poor, it didn't have that big an income, about £10,000 a year. It had a king who was almost completely dependent upon the Scottish nobility, but it remained a constant nuisance as far as Henry was concerned. And this was for a number of reasons. So firstly, the geographical size of Scotland, the rugged terrain and countryside of Scotland meant that it was difficult to invade and it was difficult to conquer. So that's the first reason. The second reason is the old alliance, AULD, with France. It frequently formed alliances with France, and this meant that England was vulnerable from an attack from Scotland in the north and attack from France in the south. And thirdly, the threat of border raids. So the threat of border raids meant that England needed to, at huge expense, maintain garrisons in Carlisle, but also in Berwick as well. So that is Scotland, a thorn in England's sides, very much so. And finally, Ireland. So from the 1460s, England had controlled just the Pale of Ireland, which is a very small area around Dublin. Most of Ireland was ruled by the Irish nobility, in particular the Fitzgeralds. And Ireland was also a problem as far as Henry was concerned, for three reasons. Firstly, it was an ideal base for an invasion. You could gather your troops in Ireland and you could then use it as a launch pad for an invasion. Secondly, it had Yorkist sympathies, as we see with Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. And thirdly, the area beyond the Pale was not in Henry's control. So that is it for today. That is it for Henry VII. What we're going to do now is we're going to focus on looking at those powers, thinking about the problems that Henry faced when he became king, how successfully did he deal with those problems. And there's one last thing I want to show you before I go, which is directly behind the camera, which is there. Can you see that little arch? That is Princess Margaret's arch. So Henry VII stayed here before Margaret headed up to Scotland to become the Queen of Scotland and marry James. Where I'm standing now, the King's Manor itself, that was the old Abbot of St Mary's Abbey, which is just behind this. Henry VII stayed here, and that arch was where Margaret headed off to start her new life in Scotland. So I will see you very soon.